Hey guys, I'm Heather.
And I'm Rochelle.
And we're from Nature vs. Narcissism,
a true crime podcast mixed with some dark humor.
Sometimes we have alcohol.
Sometimes we have guests.
Since I've always been fascinated by true crime, I wanted to delve deeper into the criminal mind and discuss why these criminals commit these vile acts.
Was it nature? Was it nurture? Or was it just plain old narcissism?
Join us every week for a brand new episode.
You can find us on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn, and Podbean.
Don't call the cops. Bye.
Welcome to No Better Death, the podcast that knows while you can die no better death than your own, that doesn't mean we can't take a look for the unusual and noteworthy in the deaths of others. Each episode will take an in-depth look at some out-of-the-ordinary deaths and the events surrounding them. This show will contain explicit language and graphic details. I am your host, Sick Grayson. How's it going, Death Nerds? I'm recording this episode not too long after the Ian Curtis episode, so I don't have much personal stuff to say and no headlines. And I think I'm saving headlines for the 6 Murder Mix episodes at this point, and those may turn into a Patreon exclusive thing once I get a Patreon set up. More details about that when I have it. This is the first ever No Better Death that comes to you as an audience request. And I don't want to weigh it down with a bunch of random side stories and updates on my boring-ass middle-aged white dude life. We're going to get straight into the meat of the episode. This topic was suggested by Death Nerd Chris Brown. Thank you, Chris. She's another No Better Death OG. I loved researching this episode. Some topics I cover on the show end up being a lot of copy and paste other people's work or research with a tiny bit of my own narrative sprinkled in, and that's it. I don't necessarily like research like that. I like something I can write about and give a deeper narrative to that a copy and paste episode doesn't really allow. Something that makes me feel like I'm writing a term paper for school, something I can organize and curate and actually use my brain on. I listen to a ton of podcasts, many because I love them, some just to see what the quote-unquote competition is, and others just out of a general curiosity. And I can tell when someone is doing a copy and paste episode. They always lack that thing, that pop, that, hey, you can't get this take anywhere else. Every history, true crime, and science-based podcast have them, so there's no hate there, but there's no denying that those episodes aren't as great as the ones that allow the host to use their own intellect and inject their own narrative into it. And this topic definitely allowed me to do that, as well as next week's topic. I really dig the research I've been doing for the next episode, but more on that later. I believe this story has been covered on Aaron Mahnke's podcast Lore, and typically I try to avoid stories that have already been covered by other shows, but it's bound to happen at some point. So just to minimize any sort of overlap or influence, I have made sure to not listen to that episode of Lore. Probably after I get done recording here, I'll go check it out just to see what Aaron's take on it was. And I wasn't really familiar with this story. I was vaguely familiar with the New England vampire panic, but not necessarily Mercy Brown. And it turns out to not really be a story singularly about Mercy Brown. It's a story of tuberculosis and people freaking out. If there's one thing old-timey white people in New England love to do, it was accuse people of being evil so they could use religion and superstition as a reason to ostracize people and inflict mental anguish, torture, pain, and death upon them, rather than, say, attempting to gain some level of scientific knowledge or common sense in order to attain a better understanding of the world around them. We saw it in their dealings with the Native Americans that already lived on the land they stole. We saw it with the innocents they brutally murdered during the Salem witch trials. And we see the same scientifically ignorant, theism-based, fear and superstition-driven zealotry here in the vampire panic. This time, luckily, most of the subjects in this panic were already dead, so it didn't have the body count of the previous witch hunts, for lack of a better term. However, unlike the witch panic of 200 years prior, where you could make some bullshit argument that someone could be practicing witchcraft without proof, because what concrete proof is there in such a case? It's just one person's word against others. The vampire panic had a sound medical explanation. Unfortunately, this explanation, discovered by bacteriologist Robert Koch in Germany a full decade before Mercy Brown's death, had not spread to the still fledgling colonies in what would become the US. And even if it had, the simple and pious people of New England would have most likely dismissed the medical explanation, which to them would have sounded like snake oil and magic, and they would have fallen back on the only explanation they knew for anything, which again was superstition and religion. And why am I talking about bacteriology and medicine? Because you can't talk about Mercy Brown without talking about the vampire panic. And you can't talk about the vampire panic without talking about tuberculosis. I mean, that's what it all came down to, a disease for which a vaccine would be developed within 30 years of Mercy Brown's death, and could be mitigated with antibiotics that would have been widely available within 50 years of her death. Had she not died from tuberculosis, she would have probably lived to see it all but eradicated. But what does tuberculosis have to do with vampirism? And this next part is something I do know a little bit about, because I live in Colorado Springs, a town that was built on the success of tuberculosis sanatoriums when its original mission of being a resort town went bust when the gold rush did the same. Tuberculosis has been found in human bones at least 5,000 years old, and has been identified in Egyptian mummies at least 3,000 years old. It was written about by the ancient Greeks and was well documented in medieval Europe. However, it wasn't identified as infectious and contagious until the early 1700s, and even then, anything resembling a cure or vaccine was still 2 centuries away. This next part was taken from an article I found on acs.org. Although tuberculosis, aka TB, is considered a single disease, it has been caused by at least 2 microorganisms. Long before TB began killing humans, it affected cattle. After cattle became one of humanity's client species sometime between 8000 and 4000 BCE, there's evidence that Mycobacterium bovis infected humanity through the ingestion of milk. This coincides with the earliest discoveries of telltale lesions in human spines dating from 5000 BCE. However, after 1000 BCE, the strain of TB seems to have changed. After that time, pulmonary TB became widespread and is suspected to have evolved from bovine TB that developed among milk-drinking Indo-Europeans who then spread pulmonary TB on their migrations around the globe. By the first millennium BCE, pulmonary TB was endemic throughout the world. So this started with the OG white people drinking shit their bodies weren't designed to drink. Then they spread the shit across the globe on their missions to find salt and coats, steal land, shove religion down people's throats, and kill those who refused to assimilate. And I bet that was the only negative effect of their actions ever. The earliest recorded symptoms of pulmonary TB, cough, expectoration, and wasting, are found in the library of Assurbanipal, who was the king of Assyria. These same symptoms were well known in early London and Paris. Pulmonary TB was romanticized in the arts and music of the 19th century. The deaths of Mimi in Puccini's La Bohème and Satine in Moulin Rouge are portrayed as romantic, tragic events. But end-stage pulmonary TB is anything but glamorous, and Mimi and Satine exposed everyone around them to danger with each breath. The dying consumptive faced night sweats and chills, paroxysmal cough, spread of the disease to other organs of the body, and of course, the wasting away that led helpless bystanders to name the disease consumption in the first place. And if you take anything away from that passage, let it be the words consumption and wasting. That is the part that plays into the vampire panic. Despite the various remedies offered by healers throughout the ages, there was no definitive treatment for the disease. While about 20% of those who contracted the disease fought it off, the other 80% were less fortunate. The first recorded treatment for pulmonary TB was developed in the early 19th century when English physician James Carson demonstrated that injecting air into the pleural cavity could collapse a lung and permit it to heal. At the time, the practice went nowhere. Despite this early promise, the first widely practiced treatment was the sanatorium cure, which was the first major advance in the treatment of TB. A Silesian student who had TB, Hermann Bremer, was told by his doctor to find a healthier climate. Bremer went to the Himalayas where he studied botany. While there, he also managed to rid himself of the disease. He returned to Germany and studied medicine. In 1854, he presented his medical dissertation with the sensational title, "Tuberculosis is a Curable Disease." Bremer then opened an inpatient hospital in Gorbersdorf where patients, surrounded by fir trees and plied with good nutrition, were exposed to continuous fresh air. This became the model for all subsequent sanatoria, including the one depicted in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Pneumothorax, the collapsing of the lung, did not become the standard treatment until it was rediscovered in 1882. The affected lung would be collapsed, which allowed it to rest and heal, but as a treatment, pneumothorax was limited. It didn't work for the late stages of the disease. In the early 20th century, Edward Archibald, a surgeon of the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal and himself a recovered consumptive, heard of a new surgical treatment for cases in which artificial pneumothorax was not possible. This method removed portions of the upper ribs on one side of the body to collapse the rib cage. While drastic, this extrapleural thoracoplasty allowed even certain late-stage tubercular lungs to collapse and heal. Ingenious as this treatment and further refinements were, it was never widely popular. Nonetheless, Archibald was the first surgeon in North America to surgically treat late-stage TB. The procedure offered otherwise doomed patients a chance to recover. The discovery of X-rays in the 1890s would allow physicians to monitor the progress of the disease. The discovery of penicillin and sulfonamide set off a wealth of investigations not only to see what diseases these magic bullets cured, but to look for new magic bullets. However, neither wonder drug was effective against TB. That wouldn't happen until the discovery of streptomycin. Streptomycin was the magic bullet that researchers had long sought. It combined low toxicity with high inhibitory effect, and on November 20th, 1944, the first critically ill TB patient was treated, and the results were gratifyingly dramatic. Several anti-TB drugs followed. They were important because therapy with a single drug soon sparked resistant TB strains. Multi-drug therapy avoided this problem. And that really should have been the end of the story. In the second half of the 20th century, rates of TB infection dropped throughout the developed world. In 1987, the American Medical Association's Advisory Council for the Elimination of TB projected that by 2010, the disease would become extinct worldwide, like one of humanity's other great scourges, smallpox. Yet the warning signs that this would not happen were already there. By 1985, for the first time, the number of new TB cases stagnated and then began to rise. The World Health Organization now calls TB a fire raging out of control in developing nations, among the poor, in prisons, and in people with HIV. Worldwide, someone becomes infected with TB every second. So what happened? Why wasn't it eliminated? Why isn't it extinct? The multi-drug regimen that was developed not long after the discovery of streptomycin is effective if it is taken continually in regular doses for 6 to 8 months, and therein lies the problem. For various reasons, many patients are non-compliant. Some stop taking the drugs when they feel better, a common problem with antibiotics. Others stop because of cost or inconvenience or because they distrust the medical establishment. Particularly troubling is the fact that TB and HIV have formed a new and deadly combination. In immunocompromised people, tuberculosis is much more likely to cause infection, creating a greater number of active TB cases and more people who spread the disease. World Health Organization estimates that HIV produces 1.4 million cases of tuberculosis each year that otherwise would not appear. In addition, the increase in immigration from the developing world to developed countries, combined with the existing poverty in many areas where new immigrants tend to settle, makes a ready pool for tuberculosis. For both HIV and tuberculosis, misdiagnosis and noncompliance compound the problem. It's a classic story of artificial selection. The initial doses of the antibiotics kill off the susceptible microbes, leaving the resistant ones to reinfect the consumptive. It takes 3 years on average to develop a new antibiotic. It takes 3 months to develop a resistant bug. TB strains seen with HIV are often resistant to many drugs, so the strains being spread are that much harder to treat. To add insult to injury, M. bovis, the original form of tuberculosis that came from cattle, is back and causing TB in humans, particularly those who are HIV positive, and M. bovis 2 is developing multiple drug resistance. Currently, tuberculosis kills 4,385 people a day worldwide and historically has far surpassed the death toll of numerous other diseases, including the Black Plague. So that was just a little bit of background about tuberculosis. Again, as I stated earlier, you really only needed to take away 2 keywords from that, consumption and wasting, and the 2 basically describe the same thing. But what is that thing? It's an effect that the disease has on the body that makes the diseased appear that they're wasting away or slowly being consumed by something. Being consumed by what? Well, if you were alive in 1800s New England, you might think the affected were being consumed by vampires, because obviously that's the most logical conclusion. I mean, Jesus. I'm not going to get into the background of vampires because that would be way too long. I mean, what do you need to know? Vlad the Impaler, Elizabeth Bathory, Bram Stoker, Nosferatu, Bela Lugosi, Anne Rice, Salem's Lot, Blade, Buffy, the movie, not the series, and fucking Twilight. Are we all caught up? And I'll throw in a favorite book of mine, Konstantinos' book available through Llewellyn Press, Vampires, the Occult Truth, just to include psychic vampires in there as well. The point is, we all know what a vampire is. If you don't, raise your hand and I'll come over to your house and hit you in the head with a tack hammer because you are a retard. Tommy Boy reference. New England vampire history and hysteria began at least a full century after the region's better remembered witch trials, and although Rhode Island was seemingly the epicenter, considered the vampire capital of America long before New Orleans ever stole the title, it was a region-wide phenomenon not specific to just Rhode Island. The New England vampire panic that started in the 1790s built upon earlier outbreaks in Europe, as communities grasped for explanations for infectious diseases before such illnesses were scientifically understood. In early New England, the disease that we now know as tuberculosis was commonly called consumption, the classic symptoms being bloody cough along with fever and weight loss. To helpless loved ones, it appeared as though the victim was withering away or being consumed. Without medicine to slow its spread, TB was a devastating affliction. By the dawn of the 19th century, it was responsible for approximately 1 out of every 4 deaths in the eastern U.S. To this day, tuberculosis remains the world's most deadly infectious disease, responsible for well over 1 million deaths each year. Based on what they were seeing and a good dose of superstition, many early New Englanders believed that vampires, not disease, were responsible for the symptoms. Which, by the way, what the fuck? Lack of medical knowledge and common sense aside, don't we typically view vampires as leaving bite marks on people and killing a victim in one feeding? What fucking vampire is gonna dig itself out of a 6-foot grave, go to their family's house, feed just a little bit on 1 or 2 family members, go back to the grave, get in, and somehow bury themselves while leaving no evidence that the grave had been disturbed, just to do all this again the next time they need to feed? Even if you can somehow rationalize the existence of vampires, this methodology of feeding makes no fucking sense. I'm going to get into a 2012 Smithsonian Magazine article describing some of the graves that were found in New England more recently that were part of the New England vampire panic. Children playing near a hillside gravel mine found the first graves. One ran home to tell his mother, who was skeptical at first until the boy produced a skull. Because this was Griswold, Connecticut, in 1990, police initially thought the burials might be the work of a local serial killer named Michael Ross, and they taped off the area as a crime scene. But the brown, decaying bones turned out to be more than a century old. The Connecticut state archaeologist Nick Bellantoni soon determined that the hillside contained a colonial-era farm cemetery. New England is full of such unmarked family plots, and the 29 burials were typical of the 1700s and early 1800s. The dead, many of them children, were laid to rest in thrifty Yankee-style, simple wood coffins without jewelry or even much clothing, their arms resting by their sides or crossed over their chests. Except, that is, for burial number 4. Bellantoni was interested in the grave even before the excavation began. It was one of only 2 stone crypts in the cemetery, and it was partially visible from the mine face. Scraping away soil with flat-edged shovels and then brushes and bamboo picks, the archaeologist and his team worked through several feet of earth before reaching the top of the crypt. When Bellantoni lifted the first of the large flat rocks that formed the roof, he uncovered the remains of a red-painted coffin and a pair of skeletal feet. They lay in perfect anatomical position. But when he raised the next stone, Bellantoni saw that the rest of the individual had been completely rearranged. The skeleton had been beheaded. Skull and thigh bones rested atop the ribs and vertebrae. It looked like a skull and crossbones motif, a Jolly Roger. I'd never seen anything like it, Bellantoni recalls. Subsequent analysis showed that the beheading, along with other injuries including the rib fractures, occurred roughly 5 years after death. Somebody had also smashed the coffin. The other skeletons in the gravel hillside were packaged for reburial, but not JB, as the 50-ish male skeleton from the 1830s came to be called, because of the initials spelled out in brass tacks on his coffin lid. He was shipped to the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. for further study. Meanwhile, Bellantoni started networking. He invited archaeologists and historians to tour the excavation, soliciting theories. Simple vandalism seemed unlikely, as did robbery because of the lack of valuables at the site. Finally, one colleague asked, "Have you ever heard of the Jewett City vampires?" In 1854, in neighboring Jewett City, Connecticut, townspeople had exhumed several corpses suspected to be vampires that were rising from their graves to kill the living. In the course of his far-flung research, Bellantoni placed a serendipitous phone call to Michael Bell, a Rhode Island folklorist who had devoted much of the previous decade to studying New England vampire exhumations. The Griswold case occurred at roughly the same time as the other incidents Bell had investigated, and the setting was right. Griswold was rural, agrarian, and bordering southern Rhode Island, where multiple exhumations had occurred. Many of the other vampires, like JB, had been disinterred, grotesquely tampered with, and reburied. In light of the tales Bell told of violated corpses, even though posthumous rib fractures began to make sense. JB's accusers had likely rummaged around in his chest cavity hoping to remove and perhaps to burn his heart. A consulting folklorist at the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission for most of his career, Bell has been investigating local vampires for 30 years, long enough to watch lettering on fragile slate gravestones fade before his eyes and prosperous subdivisions arise beside once lonely graveyards. He has documented about 80 exhumations, reaching as far back as the late 1700s and as far west as Minnesota, but most are concentrated in backwoods New England in the 1800s. Many more await discovery, he believes. You read an article that describes an exhumation and they'll describe a similar thing that happened at a nearby town, says Bell, whose book, For the Dead, on the Trail of New England's Vampires, is seen as the last word on the subject, though he has lately found so many new cases that there's a second book on the way. The ones that get recorded, and I actually find them, are just the tip of the iceberg. Almost 2 decades after JB's grave was discovered, it remains the only intact archaeological clue to the fear that swept the region. Most of the graves are lost to time, and even in cases where they aren't, unnecessary exhumations are frowned upon by the locals. Bell mostly hunts for handwritten records in town hall basements, consults tombstones and old cemetery maps, traces obscure genealogies, and interviews descendants. As a folklorist, I'm interested in recurring patterns in communication and ritual, as well as the stories that accompany those rituals. I'm interested in how this stuff is learned and carried on and how its meaning changes from group to group and over time. In part because the events were relatively recent, evidence of historic vampires isn't as scarce as one might imagine. Incredulous city newspaper reporters dished about the horrible superstition on front pages. A traveling minister describes an exhumation in his daily log on September 3, 1810. The moldy spectacle, he wrote, was a solemn sight. Even Henry David Thoreau mentions an exhumation in his journal on September 29, 1859. Though scholars today still struggle to explain the vampire panics, a key detail unites them. The public hysteria almost invariably occurred in the midst of savage tuberculosis outbreaks. Indeed, the medical museum's tests ultimately revealed that J.B. had suffered from tuberculosis, or a lung disease very like it. Typically, a rural family contracted the wasting illness, and even though they often received the standard medical diagnosis, the survivors blamed early victims as vampires responsible for preying upon family members who subsequently fell sick. Often an exhumation was called for to stop the vampire's predations. The particulars of the vampire exhumations, though, vary widely. In many cases, one family and neighbors participated, but sometimes town fathers voted on the matter, or medical doctors and clergymen gave their blessings or even pitched in. Some communities in Maine and Plymouth, Massachusetts, opted to simply flip the exhumed vampire face down in the grave and leave it at that. In Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont, though, they frequently burned the dead person's heart, sometimes inhaling the smoke as a cure. In Europe, too, exhumation protocol varied with religion. Some beheaded suspected vampire corpses while others bound their feet with thorns. Often these rituals were clandestine, lantern-lit affairs, but particularly in Vermont, they could be quite public, even festive. One vampire heart was reportedly torched on the Woodstock, Vermont town green in 1830. In Manchester, hundreds of people flocked to a 1793 heart-burning ceremony at a blacksmith's forge. Timothy Mead officiated at the altar in the sacrifice to the demon vampire who it was believed was still sucking the blood of the then-living wife of Captain Burton, an early town history says. It was the month of February and good sleighing, as in riding a sleigh, not S-L-A-Y. Bell attributes the openness of the Vermont exhumations to colonial settlement patterns. Rhode Island has about 260 cemeteries per 100 square miles versus Vermont's mere 20 per 100 square miles. Rhode Island's cemeteries were small and scattered among private farms, whereas Vermont's tended to be much larger, often located in the center of town. In Vermont, it was much harder to keep a vampire hunt on the DL. As satisfying as such many theories are, Bell is consumed by larger questions. He wants to understand who the vampires and their accusers were in death and life. During his Middletown lecture, he displays a picture of a man with salt and pepper sideburns and weary eyes, an artist's reconstruction of JB's face based on his skull. I start with the assumption that people of past generations were just as intelligent as we are, Bell says. I look for the logic. Why would they do this? Once you label something just a superstition, you lock off all inquiry into something that could have been reasonable. Reasonable is not always rational. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on African American voodoo practitioners in the South who cast love spirits and curses. It's hard to imagine a population more different from the flinty, consumptive New Englanders he studies now, but Bell sees strong parallels in how they tried to manipulate the supernatural. People find themselves in dire situations where there is no recourse through regular channels, he explains. The folk system offers an alternative, a choice. Sometimes superstitions represent the only hope. The enduring sadness of the vampire stories lies in the fact that the accusers were usually direct kin of the deceased, parents, spouses, and their children. Think about what it would have taken to actually exhume the body of a relative, Bell says. The tale he always returns to is in many ways the quintessential American vampire story, one of the last cases in New England and the first he investigated as a new PhD coming to Rhode Island in 1981. History knows the 19-year-old late 19th century vampire as Mercy Brown, and we'll get into Mercy Brown in a few minutes. Mercy Brown was specifically what had been requested for this show, but before we get to Mercy Brown, we have to go through a lot of backstory. I want to save her for last, since she is easily the best known name involved in this whole thing, but she certainly wasn't the only one. You'd think with this happening after the discovery of the bacterium that causes TB, this wouldn't have been that common, but it so was. I'm going to run down a list of names that were considered to be vampires, and this is just a few. It's in no way an exhaustive list, and these are also just a few of the ones we know about. Who knows how many others this happened to? I got the following list of names from 2 more Smithsonian Magazine articles. Peter Plagojewicz, a Serbian villager accused of blood-sucking, was exhumed and staked through the heart a few weeks after his death in 1725. In his book Vampires, Burial, and Death, folklorist Paul Barber treats Plagojewicz as the quintessential European vampire because his exhumation closely follows the broader pattern of the superstition. He was the first in his village to die of a sickness, and subsequent local deaths were blamed on his late-night predations. A rather gruesome-sounding autopsy revealed what were considered the telltale signs of vampirism. I did not detect the slightest odor that is otherwise characteristic of the dead, and the body was completely fresh, one witness wrote. The hair and beard had grown on him, the old skin, which was somewhat whitish, had peeled away, and a new fresh one had emerged under it. Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth. Right. That's what it was, and not skin slippage that made the flesh look newer, or drying of the skin which made the face hair look longer, and it certainly couldn't have been his insides rotting and trying to leak out of his mouth that made it look like blood. Arnold Pale. In the early 18th century, this rural Serbian broke his neck after a fall from a hay wagon. Like many others before him, he was accused of posthumous vampirism and exhumed after a series of deaths in his village. Many of his supposed victims were dug up as well. Austrian military authorities in control of the region investigated the deaths, and their published account was widely circulated. Pale's case is thus credited with spreading the vampire superstition to Western Europe, where it took hold before reaching the New World. Nellie Vaughan, just 19 years old, she was buried in 1889 in West Greenwich, Rhode Island. Today, this so-called vampire is almost as famous as Mercy Brown, whose exhumation was discovered by international newspapers. Vaughan's cemetery has frequently been visited, vandalized, and her headstone broken. But in his book, Food for the Dead, Michael Bell presents evidence suggesting that Vaughan's is a case of mistaken identity, and that her contemporaries never accused or exhumed her. The superstition probably arose in the last half-century or so, and may be a result of confusion with Mercy, who died nearby at a similar date and age. And the admittedly creepy epitaph on her tombstone, "I am waiting and watching for you." Frederick Ransom, a Dartmouth College student from a well-respected family in South Woodstock, Vermont, he died of tuberculosis in 1817 and is an example of an educated person ensnared in the vampire panic, usually associated with misinformed farmers. Ransom's father had his body exhumed in the hopes of saving the rest of his family. His heart was burned in a blacksmith's forge. However, it did not prove a remedy for mother, sister, and 2 brothers died afterward. Ransom's surviving brother Daniel later wrote, "It has been related to me that there was a tendency in our family to consumption, and that I would die with it before I was 30. Luckily, when Daniel Ransom wrote those words, he was more than 80 years old. Bristow Congdon's child. A man named Bristow Congdon and several of his children died of tuberculosis in Rhode Island in the 1800s. The body of one of the children was exhumed, one source wrote, and the vital parts were burned in obedience to the dicta of this shallow and disgusting superstition. Though it's not entirely clear whether Congdon was African American or American Indian, the case was the first that folklorist Michael Bell has found, suggesting that the vampire tradition crossed racial lines. Annie Dennett died of consumption at the age of 21 in rural New Hampshire. In September of 1810, a traveling Free Will Baptist minister from Vermont named Enoch Hayes Place attended her exhumation, which her family undertook in an effort to save Annie's father, also sick from tuberculosis. Place's diary entry is a curious example of the participation of a respected New England minister in a vampire hunt. They opened the grave and it was a solemn sight indeed, Place wrote. A young brother by the name of Adams examined the moldy spectacle, but found nothing as they supposed they should. There was but little left except bones. Abigail Staples. In February 1796, the Cumberland, Rhode Island Town Council granted permission for Stephen Staples to exhume the body of his 23-year-old daughter Abigail, who had died of consumption. Shortly after Abigail's death, her sister Lavinia had started showing the familiar symptoms of consumption as well. Lavinia told of dreams in which a shadowy figure sat heavily on her chest and drew out her breath. During one of those dreams, she reportedly called out Abigail's name. And to me, this sounds more like psychic vampirism than the typical blood-drinking kind. Town officials consented that Staples could try an experiment to save Lavinia's life, despite noting the decision was made against the better conscience of this council. There's no record of what came of the exhumation, or for that matter, of Lavinia. The Spaulding family. In his journal entry of September 26, 1859, author Henry David Thoreau noted, "The savage in man is never quite eradicated. I have just read of a family in Dummerston, Vermont, who several of its members, having died of consumption, just burned the lungs and heart and liver of the last deceased in order to prevent any more from having it." At the same time, Thoreau himself had long been battling tuberculosis, of which he would die 3 years later, although in his case no one seems to have suspected vampire involvement. As for the episode to which Thoreau referred, it's likely the 1790s ordeal of the Spaulding family. Having lost 6 of his 11 adult children to consumption, Lieutenant Leonard Spaulding was desperate. When yet another daughter grew ill, the body of the most recently deceased child was dug up and the vital organs removed and burned. Incidentally, one vampire-adjacent belief of the day was that vines would grow between buried caskets, and that once all of the burials in a plot had been connected, another family member would die. When Spaulding's son Reuben was buried in 1794, his grave was set apart from those of his other family members, possibly to break the chain. Sarah Tillinghast. Sarah Tillinghast of Exeter, Rhode Island, the same town Mercy Brown was from, was the first of Snuffy Tillinghast's 14 children to die. When his surviving children claimed that Sarah continued to visit them at night, it might have seemed part of the natural grieving process. But by 1799, 5 more children in the family had died of consumption and another was gravely ill. When the bodies of the dead were exhumed, all except Sarah were found to be in advanced stages of decomposition. Her heart was removed and burned in front of the family home. Describing the episode decades later in 1888, author Sidney Ryder observed that peace then came to this afflicted family, but not, however, until a 7th victim had been demanded. Nancy Young. After Nancy Young of Foster, Rhode Island, died at age 19 in 1827, her sister commenced a rapid decline in health with sure indications that she must soon follow Nancy to the grave. When Nancy's other siblings began to decline, their father, Captain Levi Young, asked his neighbors and friends to exhume and burn her remains, while all the members of the family gathered round and inhaled the smoke from the burning remains. This cure apparently did not work, as 5 more children died. So we see how common this was. It started in Europe and came here to the Americas, where it was practiced for a good century at least. It was a belief held by almost everyone from poor farmers to military brass, and it seems only a few people ever stop to think, hey, this makes 0 sense. I'm going to hit you with the fast facts, a promo for a show you need to listen to, and then we'll get into the main event, the story of Mercy Brown. And with that, it is time for 5 Fast Facts about vampires. 1. A rare disease called porphyria, also called vampire or Dracula disease, causes vampire-like symptoms such as an extreme sensitivity to sunlight and sometimes hairiness. In extreme cases, teeth might be stained reddish-brown, and eventually the patient may go mad. 2. Documented medical disorders that people accused of being a vampire may have suffered from include hematodipsia, which is a sexual thirst for blood, and hermolopia, or day blindness. Anemia, also known as bloodlessness, was often mistaken for a symptom of a vampire attack. 3. Garlic, a traditional vampire repellent, has been used as a form of protection for over 2,000 years. The ancient Egyptians believed garlic was a gift from God. Roman soldiers thought it gave them courage. Sailors believed it protected them from shipwreck, and German miners believed it protected them from evil spirits when they went underground. In several cultures, brides carried garlic under their clothes for protection, and cloves of garlic were used to protect people from a wide range of illnesses. Modern-day scientists have found that the oil in garlic is a highly effective antibiotic. 4. According to some legends, a vampire may engage in sex with his former wife, which often led to pregnancy. In fact, this belief may have provided a convenient explanation as to why a widow, who was supposed to be celibate, became pregnant. The resulting child was called a gloglav in Bulgarian or vampirici in Turkish. Rather than being ostracized, the child was considered a hero who had powers to slay vampires. 5. Certain regions in the Balkans believe that fruit such as pumpkins or watermelons would become vampires if they were left out longer than 10 days or not consumed by Christmas. Vampire pumpkins or watermelons generally were not feared because they do not have teeth. A drop of blood on a fruit's skin is a sign that it is about to turn into a vampire. And 6, just for fun, I'm going to throw in a 6th. Bela Lugosi, famous for portraying Count Dracula, was buried in his full Dracula costume, including the cape. Yeah, because he never took the costume off. Have you ever watched Plan 9 from Outer Space? Bela Lugosi and Vampira. He's supposed to be a regular dude. His wife, played by Vampira, dies. He dies a week or so later, while dressed like John Q. Public, mind you, and then rises from his grave in the fucking Dracula costume. Why did he insist on wearing it? Did he think people wouldn't recognize him without it? Did he not know how flammable those costumes are? Did he not know that a corpse, reanimated by aliens, probably wouldn't be wearing a fucking Dracula costume? It made no sense to me. Anyway, this has been 6 Fast Facts about vampires.
Do you like true crime?
Are you addicted to TV shows and movies?
Do you like a good spook?
Screen of the Crime is a podcast where two gals talk about some spooky true crimes, their favorite movies, TV shows, and the alternate world where they combine.
Hosts Maggie and Tess combine detailed research and accurate TV knowledge to create a comedy podcast that mixes the disturbed with the enjoyable. Listen to Screen of the Crime on Spotify, Stitcher, and all your favorite podcast streaming sites.
Mercy Lena Brown. Her individual story isn't that long. It's pretty much as short as any of the others I just told you, so there's not a ton of detail. Her story is, however, very typical of what happened to most of the deceased during the vampire panic, and it's one of the most famous instances of these occurrences. Mercy Lena Brown, or just Lena as her family called her, lived in Exeter, Rhode Island. Deserted Exeter, it was dubbed, or simply one of the border towns. It was largely a farming community with barely fertile soil. Rocks, rocks, and more rocks, says Sheila Reynolds, president of the Exeter Historical Association. Farmers heaped stones into tumble-down walls, and rows of corn swerved around the biggest boulders. In the late 19th century, Exeter, like much of agrarian New England, was even more sparsely populated than usual. Civil War casualties had taken their toll on the community, and the new railroads and the promise of richer land to the west lured young men away. By 1892, the year Lena died, Exeter's population had dipped to just 961 from a high of more than 2,500 in 1820. Farms were abandoned, many of them later to be seized and burned by the government. Tuberculosis was harrying the remaining families. Consumption, as it was called, had started to plague New England in the 1730s, a few decades before the first known vampire scares. By the 1800s, when the scares were at their height, the disease was the leading cause of mortality throughout the Northwest, responsible for almost a quarter of all deaths. It was a terrible end, often drawn out over years, a skyrocketing fever, a hacking bloody cough, and a visible wasting away of the body. The emaciated figure strikes one with terror, reads one 18th century description. The forehead covered with drops of sweat, the cheeks painted with a livid crimson, the eyes sunk, the breath offensive, quick and laborious, and the cough so incessant as to scarce allow the wretched sufferer time to tell his complaints. Symptoms progressed in such a way that it seemed like something was draining the life and blood out of somebody. People dreaded the disease without understanding it. Though it had been identified, the tuberculosis bacterium... People dreaded the disease without understanding it. Though the bacterium had been identified in 1882, news of the discovery did not penetrate rural areas for some time, and even if it had, drug treatments wouldn't become available until the 1940s. In 1892, the year Lena died, one physician blamed tuberculosis on drunkenness and want among the poor. Fucking typical, man. Blame the poor. 19th century cures included drinking brown sugar dissolved in water and frequent horseback riding. If they were being honest, Bell says, the medical establishment would have said there's nothing we can do and it's in the hands of God. The Brown family, living on the eastern edge of town, probably on a modest homestead of 30 or 40 stony acres, began to succumb to the disease in September 1882. Lena's mother, Mary Eliza, was the first. Lena's sister, Mary Olive, a 20-year-old dressmaker, died the next year. A tender obituary from a local newspaper hints at what she endured. The last few hours she lived was of great suffering, yet her faith was firm and she was ready for the change. The whole town turned out for her funeral and sang one sweetly solemn thought, a hymn that Mary Olive herself had selected. Mary and Lena's brother Edwin, a store clerk whom one newspaper columnist described as a big husky young man, sickened too, and left for Colorado Springs, hoping that the climate would improve his health with its dry climates and tuberculosis sanatoriums. But his health did not improve. Lena, who was just a child when her mother and sister died, didn't fall ill until nearly a decade after they were buried, while Edwin was away in Colorado. Her tuberculosis was the galloping kind, which meant she might have been infected but remained asymptomatic for years, only to fade fast after showing the first signs of the disease. A doctor attended her in her last illness, a newspaper said, and informed her father that further medical aid was useless. Her January 1892 obituary was much terser than her sister's. Miss Lena Brown, who has been suffering from consumption, died Sunday morning being January 19, 1892. As Lena was on her deathbed, her brother was, after a brief remission, taking a turn for the worse. Edwin had returned to Exeter from the Colorado resorts in a dying condition, according to one account. If the good wishes and prayers of his many friends could be realized, friend Eddie would be speedily restored to perfect health, another newspaper article wrote. But some neighbors, likely fearful for their own health, weren't content with prayers. Several approached George Brown, the children's father, and offered an alternative take on the recent tragedies. Perhaps an unseen diabolical force was preying on his family. It could be that one of the three Brown women wasn't dead after all, instead secretly feasting on the living tissue and blood of Edwin, as the Providence Journal later summarized. If the offending corpse, the journal uses the term vampire in some stories but the locals seem not to, was discovered and destroyed, then Edwin would recover. The neighbors asked to exhume the bodies in order to check for fresh blood in their hearts. George Brown gave permission. On the morning of March 17, 1892, a party of men dug up the bodies of both Marys and Lena in search of a sign that one of them was rising from the grave at night to suck the energy from the living, as the family doctor and a newspaper correspondent looked on. George was absent for unstated but understandable reasons. And I found one article that says he was there, but either way, it doesn't really matter if he was there or not, but most sources say he wasn't. After nearly 10 years, Mary Olive and Mary Eliza were almost entirely decomposed, but Mercy, buried only a few months previous in the cold New England weather, was almost perfectly preserved. The vampire hunters of Exeter had found their target. The body was in a fairly well-preserved state, the newspaper correspondent later wrote. The heart and liver were removed, and in cutting open the heart, clotted and decomposed blood was found. Once they found what they were looking for, their course of action was clear. The village doctor, Harold Metcalf, explained in vain that the weather conditions would have kept her preserved and that her lungs were clearly showing symptoms of tuberculosis, not anything supernatural. But the people of Exeter weren't going to be dissuaded. Operating on the assumption that Mercy had been preying on her family since she was just a small girl and now continued her reign of terror from beyond the grave, they removed her heart and liver, burned her heart to ashes, and fed those ashes to Edwin. But it was no use. Edwin Brown died on May 2nd, 1982. Got a typo here. Edwin Brown died May 2nd, 1892, less than 2 months later. However, so-called vampires do escape the grave in at least one sense, through stories. Lena Brown's surviving relatives saved local newspaper clippings and family scrapbooks alongside carefully copied recipes. They discussed the events on Decoration Day when Exeter residents adorned the town's cemeteries. But the tale traveled much farther than they knew. Even at the time, New England's vampire panic struck onlookers as a baffling anachronism. The late 1800s were a period of social progress and scientific flowering. Many of the Rhode Island exhumations occurred within 20 miles of Newport, high society's summer nucleus, where the scions of the Industrial Revolution vacationed. At first, only people who'd lived in or had visited the vampire-ridden communities knew about the scandal. We seem to have been transported back to the darkest age of unreasoning ignorance and blind superstition instead of living in the 19th century and in a state calling itself enlightened and Christian, one writer at a small-town Connecticut paper wrote in the wake of an 1854 exhumation. But Lena Brown's exhumation made news. First, a reporter from the Providence Journal witnessed her unearthing. Then, a well-known anthropologist named George Stetson traveled to Rhode Island to probe the barbaric superstition in the surrounding area. Published in the venerable American Anthropologist Journal, Stetson's account of New England's vampires made waves throughout the world. Before long, even members of the foreign press were offering various explanations for the phenomenon. Perhaps the neurotic modern novel was driving the New England madness, or maybe shrewd local farmers had simply been pulling Stetson's leg. A writer for the London Post declared that whatever forces drove the Yankee vampire, it was an American problem and most certainly not the product of a British folk tradition, even though many families in the area could trace their lineage directly back to England. Yeah, that statement's bullshit. This came from Europe. They were just too bougie to admit it. In the Boston Daily Globe, a writer went so far as to suggest that perhaps the frequent intermarriage of families in these backcountry districts may partially account for some of their characteristics. He's calling them inbred rednecks, which is weird because the North would later come to take on a similar air of bouginess and start the stereotype that Southern Americans were inbred idiots. One 1896 New York World clipping even found its way into the papers of a London stage manager and aspiring novelist named Bram Stoker, whose theater company was touring the United States that same year. His Gothic masterpiece Dracula was published in 1897. Some scholars have said that there wasn't enough time for the news accounts to have influenced a Dracula manuscript, yet others see Lena in the character of Lucy, her very name a tempting amalgam of Lena and Mercy. A consumptive-seeming teenage girl turned vampire who is exhumed in one of the novel's most memorable scenes. Fascinatingly, a medical doctor presides over Lucy's disinterment just as one oversaw Lena's. Whether or not Lucy's roots are in Rhode Island, Lena's historic exhumation is referenced in H.P. Lovecraft's The Shunned House, a short story about a man being haunted by dead relatives that includes a living character named Mercy. And through fiction and fact, Lena's narrative continues today. Part of Bell's research involves going along on legend trips, the modern graveside pilgrimages made by those who believe or want to believe that the undead stalk Rhode Island. On legend trips, Bell is largely an academic presence. He can even be a bit of a killjoy, declaring that the main reason that no grass grows on a vampire's grave is that vampire graves have so many visitors who crush all the vegetation. You mean he applies logic to shit? That's what I do. He's not a killjoy, he's just trying to enlighten you. For almost a century after Lena died, Exeter, still sparsely settled, remained remarkably unchanged. Electric lights weren't installed in the western part of Exeter until the 1940s. And the town had 2 pound keepers charged with safekeeping stray cattle and pigs until 1957. In the 1970s, when I-95 was built, Exeter evolved into an affluent bedroom community of Providence. But visitors still occasionally turn a corner to discover the past, a dirt road cluttered with wild turkeys, or deer hopping over stone fences. Some elderly locals square dance in barns on the weekends, and streets keep their old names: Sodom Trail, Nooseneck Hill. The white wooden Chestnut Hill Baptist Church in front of Lena Cemetery, built in 1838, has its original blown glass windows. Though it's a somber place, there's no immediate clue that an accused vampire was buried here. Unlike Salem, Exeter doesn't promote its dark claim to fame, and remains in some respects an insular community. Old-timers don't like the hooded figures who turn up, or the cars idling with the lights off. They say the legend should be left alone, perhaps with good reason. In 2011, I believe it was, a couple of teenagers were killed on a pilgrimage to Lena's grave when they lost control of their car on Purgatory Road. Most vampire graves stand apart, in wooded spots outside modern cemetery fences where snow melts slower and there's a thick understory of ferns. But the Chestnut Hill Cemetery is still in use. And there is Lena. She lies beside the brother who ate her heart and the father who let it happen. Other markers are freckled with lichen, but not hers. The stone looks to have been recently cleaned. It has been stolen over the years, and now an iron strap anchors it to the earth. People have scratched their names into the granite. They leave offerings, plastic vampire teeth, and cough drops. Once there was a note that said, "You go, girl." How did 19th century Yankees, remembered as the most pious and practical of peoples, come to believe in vampires? Especially when the last known vampire panics at the time hadn't occurred since the 18th century in Europe. Some modern scholars have linked the legend to vampiric symptoms of certain rare diseases. Exeter residents at the time claimed that the exhumations were a tradition of the Indians. I call bullshit on that one. The legend originated in Slavic Europe, where the word vampire first appeared in the 10th century. Bell believes that Slavic and German immigrants brought the vampire superstitions with them in the 1700s, perhaps when Palatine Germans colonized Pennsylvania, or Hessian mercenaries served in the Revolutionary War. The first known reference to an American vampire scare is a scolding letter to the editor of the Connecticut Current and Weekly Intelligencer, published in June 1784. Councilman Moses Holmes from the town of Willington warned people to beware of a certain quack doctor, a foreigner, who had urged families to dig up and burn dead relatives to stop consumption. Holmes had witnessed several children disinterred at the doctor's request and wanted no more of it. And that the bodies of the dead may rest quiet in their graves without such interruption, I think the public ought to be aware of being led away by such an impostor. But some modern scholars have argued that the vampire superstition made a certain degree of practical sense. In Vampires, Burials, and Death, folklorist Paul Barber dissects the logic behind vampire myths, which he believes originally arose from unschooled but astute observations of decay. Bloated dead bodies appear as if they have recently eaten. A staked corpse screams due to the escape of natural gases, and so on. The seemingly bizarre vampire beliefs, Barber argues, get at the essence of contagion, the insight that illness begets illness and death begets death. While New England's farmers may have been guided by something like reason, the spiritual climate of the day was also hospitable to vampire rumors. Contrary to their puritanical reputation, rural New Englanders in the 1800s were a fairly heathen lot. Only about 10% belonged to a church. Rhode Island, originally founded as a haven for religious dissenters, was particularly lax. Christian missionaries were at various points dispatched there from more godly communities. The missionaries came back and lament that there were no Bibles in the home, no church-going whatsoever. But even then, you're still talking about 17 and 1800s, so even the most lax people were still overtly religious. I think we need to take a look at the context of the time and compare it to now, rather than just saying, oh, these people didn't have Bibles, they weren't religious. Like, everyone was religious back then. It was just a matter of to what degree. There really was no, it was very rare to find people that were just not religious at all. So I don't think you could say these people weren't Christian. They just weren't as hardcore as people in other communities. Mary Olive, Lena's sister, joined a church just 2 weeks before she died, her obituary said. But keep in mind, there were other states and towns where people who were Christian, more Christian than this town apparently, were doing the same thing. It had nothing to do with religion or lack thereof. Ultimately, it came down to desperation, and these people they didn't have science, they didn't have medicine, they had two things to go on, and that was religion and superstition. So it didn't really matter where you were, you suffered from one of those two things, either being super religious or being super suspicious, and out of desperation, something had to be done. And at the time, I guess, this was the most logical thing to do to them. One missionary is quoted as having written, "In place of organized worship, superstitions reigned, magical springs with healing powers, dead bodies that bled in the presence of their murderers, people buried shoes by fireplaces to catch the devil if he tried to come down the chimney. They nailed horseshoes above doors to ward off evil and carved daisy wheels, a kind of colonial hex sign, into the door frames." If superstition likely fanned the vampire panics, perhaps the most powerful forces at play were communal and social. By 1893, there were just 17 people per square mile in Exeter. A fifth of the farms were fully abandoned, the fields turning slowly back into forest. In her monograph, The New England Vampire Belief, Image of the Decline, Gothic literature scholar Fay Ringel Hazel hints at a vampire metaphor behind the westward hemorrhage. The migration seemed to drain rural New England of its most enterprising young citizens, leaving the old and unfit behind. As Exeter teetered near collapse, maintaining social ties must have taken on new importance. An exhumation represented first and foremost a duty to one's own kin, dead or dying. The ritual would alleviate the guilt someone might feel for not doing everything they could do to save a family, to leave no stone unturned. Even more significant, in small communities where disease could spread quickly, an exhumation was an outward display that you were doing everything you can to fix the problem. Residents of the already beleaguered town were likely terrified. They knew that if consumption wiped out the Brown family, it could take out the next family, Bell says. George Brown was being entreated by the community. He had to make a gesture. The strongest testament to the power of the vampire myth is that George Brown did not, in fact, believe in it, according to the Providence Journal. It was he who asked a doctor to perform an autopsy at the graveyard, and he who elected to be elsewhere during the ritual. He authorized his loved one's exhumation, the Journal says, simply to satisfy the neighbors who were, according to another newspaper account, worrying the life out of him, a description with its own vampiric overtones. Perhaps it was wise to let them have their way, since George Brown, apparently not prone to tuberculosis, had to coexist with his neighbors well into the next century. He died in 1922. Relatives of the Browns still live in Exeter and are laid to rest on Chestnut Hill. Some, planning ahead, have erected their grave markers. It can be disconcerting to drive past somebody's tombstone on the way to his or her home for a vampire-oriented interview. Brown's descendants still possess a family treasure, a quilt that Lena sewed. The cotton bedspread is pink, blue, and cream. What look from a distance like large patches of plain brown fabric are really fields of tiny daisies. It's the work of a farm girl without any wastefulness. Lena clearly ran out of material in places and had to scrimp for more. Textile scholars at the University of Rhode Island have traced her snippets of florals, plaid, and paisley to the 1870s and 1800s when Lena was still a child. They wondered if she'd used her sister's and mother's old dresses for the project. Perhaps her mother's death, too, explains Lena's quilting abilities, which are considerable for a teenager. She might have had to learn about household skills before other girls. Says Dorothy O'Neill, one of the quilt's recent custodians and a descendant of Lena, "I think the quilt is exquisite, especially in light of what she went through in her life. She ended up leaving something beautiful. She didn't know she'd have to leave it, but she did." But Lena hasn't left entirely. She is said to frequent a certain bridge manifested as the smell of roses. She appears in children's books and paranormal television specials. She murmurs in the cemetery, say those who leave tape recorders there to capture her voice. She's rumored to visit the terminally ill and to tell them that dying isn't so bad. The quilt pattern that Lena used, very rare in Rhode Island, is sometimes called the Wandering Foot, and it carried a superstition of its own. Anybody who slept under it, the legend said, would be lost to her family, doomed to wander. And that, ladies, gentlemen, non-binaries, and other worldly beings, is the story of Mercy Brown and the New England vampire panic. What did we learn? Get your tuberculosis vaccinations. Don't believe in old world bullshit. Trust science and medicine over religion or superstition, as flawed as it may be. It's still better than the alternatives. And go to the doctor if you start having a bloody cough. Oh, and we also learned that Bela Lugosi was a weirdo who refused to take off his Halloween costume. NoBetterDeath.info for all info on No Better Death. Don't put a www on that, just NoBetterDeath.info, or you can go to NoBetterDeath.podbean.com for access to show notes, links to social media, places to listen to the show, etc., etc. Follow, like, subscribe, or leave a review wherever you listen to this, and if you would be so kind, tell your friends, get them listening. Do whatever you can on whatever platform you use. I'm currently kicking around ideas for merch and a Patreon, as I've mentioned over the last couple episodes. I just keep not really getting to the part where I set it in action. I'm just still in the idea phase. More info on that when I have it. Please, by all means, contact me if you have personal stories about death, stories you want to hear on the show, questions, or maybe you just want to say hello to your fellow death nerds. Hit me up and I'll get it on the air. This whole episode came together from one listener saying, "Hey, I want to hear about this." It's that easy. Best ways to contact me are on the No Better Death Facebook page, No Better Death 1 on Twitter, or you can email me at nobetterdeath@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. The audience is growing daily, and I can't tell you how much it means to me, and I thank you to the other podcasts who have been promoting this show. I know a lot of you came over from That's Weird, or maybe the Tennish podcast, and that's dope. Podcasters need to support other podcasters, and if we can have some crossing over of audiences, I'm all for it. Next week, we're going to take a look at deaths revolving around the world's space programs in an episode titled Dead in Space. So stay tuned to that one. I'm a big space nerd, so it was really fun for me putting that together. I'm going to send you out on an instrumental track from my electronic project called Odd God. In the words of the great Gary Newman, my name is Ruin, my name is Vengeance, my name is No One, my name is Sick Grayson. Until next time, try not to die.